Down on her luck, Leah Joy Ward hopes to cash in on her charm.
This is my friend Leah.
Leah was attractive. She had a beautiful smile. She could hold conversation.
A trifecta of qualities that score her the ultimate fortune with handsome entrepreneur Ijaz Ahmad.
Okay.
He was a giving person. He would help anybody.
He had a need to be a husband. He had the need to be the head of a family.
Where have you been?
But in Leah, the divorced dad finds a fixer-upper beyond repair.
Get out of my way and leave me alone!
I knew right away that she was evil.
I knew it!
Leah Ward was not going to be dumped. She wasn't going to be cut out.
I thought that I was having a nightmare.
Oh my God!
And when I didn't wake up, that's what scared me even more.
When Ijaz Ahmad arrives in the United States from Pakistan in 1988, the 26-year-old has the American dream in his sights.
Ijaz Ahmad came over here, like most of our immigrants, trying to find a better life.
He had already obtained a bachelor's degree in engineering and arrives in Memphis because he's going to school for his second degree.
While enrolled at the University of Memphis, Ijaz picks up a variety of jobs. But the one thing eluding him most is love in his life.
It was important to him, as part of his faith, to be married and to be in a relationship.
That all changes in the spring of 1988, when Ijaz meets 22-year-old Spitfire, Bonnie Marsh.
My mom introduced me to Ijaz through one of his close mutual friends.
Would you like some sweet tea?
Yes, please. Thank you.
You could tell he was a nice person, that he had been reared right.
He walked in, he was very handsome. He had a sparkle in his eye, and I fell in love with him instantly. After our first initial meeting, we dated, had dinner, went to the movies, would talk on the phone all night long, laugh and giggled, and it was a very innocent relationship.
Then suddenly, after they dated for a while, I was working in the yard. They come up and wanted me to go with them to get married.
Today.
Well, congratulations. Well, I was real happy because he really loved her.
In autumn of 1988, the two marry, and just over a year later, they welcome baby Jordan. Ijaz calls him Tariq, which means desert warrior.
Ijaz was an amazing father. He was very attentive, and I have never seen such love between a father and son as between Jordan and Ijaz.
But with Jordan's arrival, simmering tensions over the couple's religious differences become more pronounced. And when Jordan is only 3 years old, they amicably divorce.
He was not happy about my decision to stay Christian. And for Ijaz, it became all or nothing at that time.
Bonnie and Jordan move in with her mother, while Ijaz copes with the divorce by sinking himself into work.
Ijaz was kind of self-made. He bought houses, fixed them up, rented them out. He would get old cars, fix them, resell them for a profit. He made his own way.
By the time he's 40, Ijaz buys his own home in a suburb of Memphis. He shares custody of Jordan, now 10 years old, but he's forlorn without a wife. Then in September of 2002, one of his mechanics introduces him to a female friend, 26-year-old Leah Joy Ward.
Leah was attractive. She had blonde hair, she had a beautiful smile, she could hold conversation. She was an intelligent girl.
Sure, that's fine.
Yeah, she was just hanging around the shop. She just got in from out of town.
But the mechanic explains she doesn't have a place to live, she's the mother of 2 children, she's hungry, and Ijaz is attracted to her personality, but he also feels that he needs to help this woman.
Leah tells Ijaz her ex-husband has custody of their kids and that he kicked her out with just the clothes on her back.
Ijaz didn't want this woman to be out on the mean streets of Memphis by herself. He actually moved her into one of his rental homes, and he checked on her and made sure that she had the things that she needed.
Sure, as a Muslim, it's mine.
But the house is in an area of town that is not the safest or the best place.
Ijaz invites Leah to his home and makes her an even better offer.
I can move you to another house, or...
He says, I want you to take my home because it is in a better neighborhood.
Well, okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Ijaz's faith prohibited him from living with a woman who is not his relative and who he is not legally married to.
The new arrangement forces Ijaz to move in with a friend, but it also invites more opportunities for the two to spend time together. And the topic of discussion is most often Leah.
She told him that because of family, of abusive men, of a horrible life, she just could not attain her dream.
Leah wants to become a nurse, and with Ijaz's support, her goal starts to feel real.
He had a need to be a husband. He had the need to be the head of a family. He loved the child that he had, and he wanted more children. So he thought he could help Leah and build a relationship out of that.
A few weeks after Leah moves in, Ijaz's former mother-in-law pays him an unannounced visit.
It's so good to see you.
She is disturbed by what she sees.
I went over there and she was laying on the couch. She got up and he introduced her.
If Ijaz is hoping for Tina's approval, he doesn't get it.
She wasn't very friendly. She said I was up all night and I was just getting some sleep. She was supposed to be in school and then I'm working with people on the side. My antennas went up that she wouldn't look you in the eyes. She wants you to ask her anything.
How's Jordan?
Oh, Jordan is fine, honey, and he misses you.
Ijaz seems oblivious to Tina's disapproval, and after a little over a month of knowing Leah, he proposes.
Right away, Leah agrees to the marriage, and she tells him she's very interested in his religion and she will convert.
Ijaz yearned for a Muslim woman to share the same values with him and to walk with him and to attend the mosque with him. I was happy for Ijaz that he finally found that passion that would hold him together with someone who believed the same way he did.
How are you?
Days later, Ijaz wants to surprise his 11-year-old son, Jordan, who has yet to meet Leah.
I was in 6th grade. My dad stopped by my school and wanted to get me out of school early, and he was really excited and he wanted to surprise me with something, but I didn't want to go.
Yeah, but you know, you don't want to miss this surprise. I'm telling you, you don't want to miss this. Can you come?
I don't think I can. It's just the most important test. I've been studying for it.
And I ended up not going with him.
The following day, Ijaz and Leah are married at a local mosque.
Leah looks beautiful. She's wearing the hijab. It's a lovely ceremony. Ijaz's best friend performs the ceremony, and there are these people in the mosque that do not know Leah. They've never met her, but they are happy for their friend Ijaz.
I found out later on that weekend that he had married Leah. I was actually really surprised.
Kabul.
Congratulations.
Jordan doesn't meet his new stepmother, Leah, until after the wedding.
My first impressions of her were pretty good. Leah seemed really charismatic and wanted to get to know me, and was really interested in our family, and she seemed really nice.
The following weekend, Leah's children, ages 4 and 6, come into town to visit.
Leah and my dad, they took me and her kids out to the park and to the store. Really anything that they did, they included us. She treated me like her kid. Overall, it seemed like she wanted to be a good stepmother.
Finally, it seems Ajaz has achieved it all.
They live in this nice house. Leah could pursue her educational goals. They could raise their 3 children together, and they would be a perfect couple.
But weeks into their marriage, the facade begins to crack.
I knew it.
And then out of nowhere, these rages would show up.
She scraped her fingers across the palm of my hand,
Charmed.
and a cold shiver immediately ran down my spine.
It is none of your business.
If she's willing to physically hit him, then what more is she willing to do?
When 40-year-old Ajaz Ahmad and 26-year-old Leah Ward marry, the newlyweds and their 3 children from previous marriages appear to become a happily blended family.
Now he had a wife and a female figure in his home for his son Jordan. She even volunteered to become a member of his mosque and started wearing a traditional Muslim-type clothing.
The next time Ajaz picks his son Jordan up from his ex-wife, he brings Leah with him to meet her.
But she never got out of the car. So I walked over to the car and extended my hand, and she reached out to the palm of my hand and scraped her fingers across.
Charmed.
I had a sick feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I knew something was wrong. And I said, that woman is evil.
One thing is certain. Leah doesn't want anything to do with Bonnie or her mother, Tina.
I believe that Leah does not like the fact that Ijaz remains friends with Bonnie, and this angered Leah to no end. Why do you have to talk to her? Are you still seeing her? What's going on with you two? And Ijaz would try to explain, this is my ex-wife. We have a child together. We are still friends. I am still friends with that family.
Leah and I weren't physically around each other much, but we spoke on the phone quite frequently. And I would ask to speak to Ijaz. And she said, why is that? I simply stated, he is the father of my child. May I speak to him now? I'll let him know that you called as soon as he makes it back. Click.
Tell me where he is.
Hang up on me.
And Leah's jealous behavior isn't reserved just for Bonnie.
Leah became obsessed with Ijaz. She wants to know where he is. Who is he talking to? What is he doing?
Ijaz had dinner with a friend of his, a business associate actually, and that business associate brought his secretary with him.
I knew it.
Leah showed up from out of nowhere and stormed into the restaurant accusing him of having an affair with that woman.
He is mine.
Leah.
You just back off.
Well, this embarrasses Ijaz, and he excuses himself from the table. And his 2 friends, they had never met Leah, so they had no idea who she was or what she was doing.
Dad, do not touch me.
Leah.
Everybody was very concerned by the level of anger and hostility that she displayed.
What are you looking at?
He had no idea what to make of this. And Ijaz is starting to tell friends, this isn't the woman I married. This is not the relationship I thought it was going to be.
Hoping to avoid yet another fight, the couple agrees to spend their first Thanksgiving with Leah's parents and extended family.
Now, Ijaz loved holidays, and he loved Thanksgiving. And Leah decides, we're going to spend the holiday with my family.
But unexpectedly, among the invited guests is Leah's ex-husband, Larry.
Now, Larry and Ijaz have never met. Larry's bringing Leah's 2 kids.
Leah has only told Ijaz that Larry kicked her out of their home.
Ijaz walks over to Larry, extends his hand, introduces himself, and he said, "I hear you are mean." And Larry glances over at Leah and says, "Buddy, you don't know mean."
The unexpected comment catches Ijaz off guard, but he leaves it at that. The afternoon passes without further incident until Ijaz is sitting alone after dinner.
Leah's little daughter comes up to him and in a very sweet voice says, "Why did you marry my mommy? My mommy is still married to my daddy."
Given her age, Ijaz thinks the child may be confused.
What do you mean?
But it makes him wonder, could she be telling the truth? Is Leah a bigamist?
Ijaz is shocked by this, but he doesn't want to ruin the holiday for everybody. And so he sort of puts it away rather than confront Leah there.
As the Christmas holidays approach, Ijaz's focus on his businesses takes a back seat to his family's needs. As he reviews some financial statements, one of his accounts comes up short by $1,000.
So Ijaz confronts Leah and asks, "Where did this $1,000 go?" And Leah explains very flippantly,
Christmas gifts for the kids.
$1,000 worth of gifts?
Do you want the kids to have Christmas or not?
Fine, I don't want to argue with you.
Ijaz isn't sure if he can believe her.
Thus far, Ijaz has helped Leah. And because of who he was not one to mistrust. But now things are taking a turn, and he is starting to see Leah is not who he thought she was.
Once again, instead of causing a fight, Ijaz chooses to let the matter go. A few days later, Jordan is excited for an outing with Leah and his step-siblings.
She took me and her kids to the mall, and we were told that we could go into the mall and meet her at a certain time.
For 3 children, all under the age of 12, wandering alone in the mall proves overwhelming. They quickly return to the spot where Leah left them.
Before we even got back to the spot, she had called my dad and was saying that she couldn't find us and that we had run off.
Look, I don't know where they went. We're just in the mall.
She started fussing and getting ugly towards them, all 3. And she said, "You should have been here an hour ago." She didn't even know what time it was. And Jordan knew that she was wrong. Them other 2 kids didn't say anything. I think they were afraid of her.
It was kind of weird how she just would try and make up some lie to tell him to get us in trouble. Seemed like she had an ulterior motive at that point, but I couldn't understand why she wanted to get us.
Ijaz is equally perplexed by the situation.
He questioned her and said, "Well, why would you have even let them run off? You're there, you're supposed to be watching them." It didn't make sense to him.
I am tired of you getting on my case.
Little does Jordan know the incident at the mall is just the beginning of a nightmare he will never forget.
Leave me alone.
Evil can hide behind many faces.
What the hell are you doing?
He told me that Leah was capable of anything. And I said, "What do you mean?"
When Ijaz Ahmad and Leah Ward meet, they quickly get married. For both, the relationship is a second chance at all that love has to offer. But after a few months, Ijaz's 11-year-old son Jordan finds himself questioning what his dad sees in his new stepmother.
Me and my dad were at home, and we were watching a movie. It was late at night, and she came home, and my dad simply asked her where she had been. He hadn't heard from her.
Leah would just disappear. She would be gone for hours, and she would never explain where she was.
Leah's reaction catches Jordan and Ijaz by surprise.
You know what, Ijaz? I am tired of you getting on my case.
She raised her voice at him, and they started arguing.
Stop being so controlling.
Leah.
She was not acting like herself, or what I thought was herself. She pounded her fists into his chest
Get out of my way. Leave me alone.
and stormed into the bedroom. It was very unexpected.
Leah appeared to just have absolute fits of rage anytime things didn't go her way. Her response was emotional, it was violent, and it was incredibly quick in its onset.
Now, Ijaz believes, and his religion says, never hurt a woman, so he is standing there with his hands up.
He never lashed out at Leah or struck her.
Seeing his stepmom's behavior concerns the 11-year-old Jordan.
When I heard that rage in her, I was kind of frightened. You know, if she's willing to physically hit him, then what more is she willing to do?
After only 5 months of marriage, the strain between the couple is becoming toxic, and everyone can see it.
The relationship is crumbling. Big cracks are starting to show. Ijaz is not taking care of himself. He is wearing clothes that are not ironed. His hair is messy. He's not washing it. And his eyes had lost that spark.
Seeing Ijaz, the bags under his eyes, his pale skin, the timbre of his voice, the essence of him was slowly dying inside. He was scared and did not know how to handle the situation.
Jordan was helping me clean up the backyard, and she came with Ijaz. I noticed she was just so nervous and doing her hands like this, and I noticed her fingernails were ragged looking, and I knew something was wrong. She might have been a pretty girl, but evil can hide behind many faces.
And just when he thinks it can't get any worse, it does.
A letter arrives, and it's from the Department of Corrections.
What is this?
Not any of your business.
The notification comes from the federal parole board. They want to see Leah and have a parole hearing. Leah started getting in trouble with the drug trade and was arrested and prosecuted federally.
Leah, what is it?
All right, I'm just gonna come out and say it.
Leah has violated parole. Now she has to tell Ijaz. She's on parole. She spent time in prison, and it was for a drug charge.
Parole? What the hell for?
The news comes as a complete shock.
My dad didn't want to hide much from me. He told me that he had found out that she was on parole. That's probably one thing that he was pretty strict about, was no alcohol, no drugs of any kind. I think that she was on the road to recovery, so I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, but I was wondering how much more she was going to lie about.
Ijaz confided in me that he married Leah too hastily. He found out things about Leah that were disturbing, and he didn't know what to do about it. When I found out about prison, drug use, checkered past, it scared me. So I knew why Ijaz was so fearful.
I think that he also wanted to make sure that I was protected. He felt like he had compromised me and my safety by just simply having her in the same household.
Excuse me?
You heard me.
Ijaz believes Leah is no longer trustworthy, but he is caught in a heart-wrenching quandary.
He didn't want another divorce. He didn't want to go through that heartbreak again, and he had become very close to her children. He didn't want to lose them.
All I can imagine is that he's weighing out the tenets of his religion and what his obligation is at this point.
By April of 2005, Ijaz's ex-wife Bonnie is also fearful for Jordan's safety, so she decides to do her own snooping around.
I followed Leah, sat in my car, and watched her get out of her vehicle and saw a strange man meet her. And I knew that she was up to no good. When Leah was with Ijaz, she would dress very conservatively and wear a hijab at the mosque. But this person I saw that night was dressed promiscuously.
Bonnie doesn't tell Ijaz about what she sees, but it reinforces her belief that her ex needs to leave his wife, and fast.
I told Ijaz to go stay with a friend for a week and give Leah the ultimatum to get her stuff out because that was his home.
My dad came to me and he told me some things had been going on with him and Leah, and he asked me if he should leave her. I told him, if you're not happy, then you need to leave her.
For all of Jordan's 11 years, very few days have gone by without some form of contact from his father, Ijaz.
My dad was my best friend. I spent a lot of time with my dad, and we talked almost every day, even when I wasn't there with him on the weekends.
So when several days pass without a word from his dad, Jordan is surprised.
I tried calling him, and it went straight to voicemail.
Jordan tries reaching him again. This time, it's Leah who answers the phone.
She said your daddy went to West Memphis, went to get some cars, because he bought used cars.
I called Leah back. I said, when will he be back? Click. I called again. I said, I need you to tell me where my son's father is. She said, you should have thought about that when you were married to him. He's not your problem anymore. Click.
She hung up.
I spoke to her multiple times over the phone, and each time she would tell me that he was at a further and further place.
Almost 3 weeks pass, and Jordan still can't reach his dad. He calls Ijaz's number again.
She told me that my dad had gone to Pakistan and he wouldn't be back for a month. I knew at that point that she was lying.
Give me the phone.
I said, you know what? I'm tired of you lying to me. He would always get in touch with Jordan if he were to leave the country. I was very angry.
At that point, I knew something was really wrong, and we needed to figure out what was really going on.
Bonnie decides to find out for herself what's going on. Without telling anyone, she heads over to Ijaz's house after work.
I walked up, looked inside the windows. All the furniture was gone. I knew that something terrible had happened. I was scared. Felt like somebody was watching me. And my first instinct was to run.
Bonnie hurries home and tells her mom, Tina, what she saw. The following day, Tina decides to drive over to Ijaz's house and take a look for herself.
I got home from school and my grandmother was about to leave. And I said, well, don't go by yourself, let me go with you.
We went over there and we looked through the windows and the house was wrecked.
There was no furniture and there were flies in the windowsill. What my mom was telling me at that moment was something bad had happened to my dad and we needed to get the police involved.
But before they leave, Jordan and Tina check the backyard.
As we were approaching the backyard, through the fence, we started smelling this really foul odor. It was the worst smell you could ever imagine. We walked into the backyard, and the closer we got to the shed, the worse the smell got.
Jordan went over there and he pushed the door to the side. And when we did, that's where the odor was coming from.
I saw an egg crate foam topper laying on the ground with a bulge in it. And I asked my grandmother to lift it up. And when she lifted it up,
I knew it was a body there.
Oh my God.
I let it down real quick, but Jordan saw some anyway. He said, "It's my daddy." I said, "You don't know that. We got to get out of here and call the police."
I thought for a moment I was having a nightmare and that I would wake up. And when I didn't wake up, that's what scared me even more.
I got Jordan out, and I said, "Go to the house across the street." And I asked the woman, could I call the police? I was so distraught, I couldn't even remember my name.
Moments later, police arrive on the scene.
The body was wrapped in plastic and hog-tied and drug into a storage shed with an egg crate mattress over it.
But the body is decomposed to a point it cannot be positively identified on the scene.
They started questioning me and my grandmother, trying to figure out who we were and asking what we think happened or who could have done this. And I couldn't remember my own name or where I lived. My mind was completely blank, and I was in shock.
I called Bonnie and I said, "Get over here. You have got to get Jordan. He don't need to be here."
Bonnie arranges for a relative to take Jordan home so she and her mother can remain on the scene as police continue their investigation.
The detective came over and I said, "It's Ijaz, isn't it?"
We haven't identified the victim yet.
She said, "When we do find out for sure, we will let you know." The detective called me the following morning.
The body is positively identified as Ijaz Ahmad.
His head had been cut off. There had been multiple attempts to sever his leg.
The police asked me, did I have any idea who would want to harm Ijaz? I said, absolutely. Leah.
My immediate thought was Leah. She was the one that probably did this.
Police just need to find her.
Leah Ward is nowhere to be found.
If they'd have just not found that body for a couple more days, she would have had the perfect alibi.
Following the gruesome discovery of Ijaz Ahmad's body in a backyard shed, all signs point to his wife Leah as the suspect.
I knew that she had killed my father. I told the police they needed to find out where she was.
3 days later, police locate Leah in federal custody.
Leah surfaces. She has self-reported to go back to prison to serve out 4 months because she violated her parole.
Investigators learn Leah had a previous conviction for drugs, a secret she had initially kept from Ijaz.
Leah is more than happy to talk to them because of her parole violation. And the officers explain, this is bigger than a parole violation. We need to speak to you about what happened with Ijaz Ahmad.
When police tell Leah about Ijaz, she breaks down and decides to confess.
She starts telling the officers that when Ijaz found out that she was on parole and she had violated her parole, he was so enraged that he just beat her and he hit her and he yelled and he screamed and he threatened her with her life. She said, I'd never seen him this angry. And when he stepped away from me, that's when I grabbed the gun. That's when I aimed it at him, and it was only to protect myself.
She said he was coming at her, he was going to attack her, and so she fired the pistol. and it struck him in the heart, and it killed him.
Leah admits to shooting Ijaz twice in the chest.
She said she let the body lay there for a couple days. She dragged it into the bathroom so that it wouldn't bleed on the hardwood floors, and she tried to get it in the bathtub, but that she couldn't physically do it. Insects had started gathering in his eyes and nostrils, so that's why she cut the head off.
Leah told investigators that she put the body on a piece of plastic, and then she dragged the body out to the front yard to put in the garbage can. But it was heavy, so she pulled it around to the back, and she placed him in the shed.
Leah claims she can't remember what she did with the murder weapon, and it's never found. But swords similar to those she used to dismember Ijaz are recovered in a storage locker she rents.
So Leah's saying that this was self-defense. But when the head's missing, there needs to be a little bit more of an explanation. This is somebody who has a lot of anger. This is very personal. And she said he busted the bedroom door down and was coming at her, and that's when she had to shoot him. She apparently didn't think the story out too much because the door jamb was clear that the door had not been broken in. There was no damage to the door or to the door jamb of any nature.
The DA's office charges Leah Joy Ward with first-degree murder. Pam Stark is assigned the case, her first as assistant DA.
There was absolutely no doubt in my mind after I looked at this case that Leah Ward was not going to be dumped. She wasn't going to be cut out. She wasn't going to be left. She didn't put any blame on herself. It was all on Ijaz.
Two years later, Leah's trial begins in Memphis. Bonnie, Tina, and 14-year-old Jordan are there.
She looked a lot different than when she was with my dad. She had cut her hair and dyed it, and she looked a lot older.
Leah sat at the table, very calm, very composed, as if she is just watching something that happened to somebody else and not to her. The defense stated that Leah was fighting for her life. Ijaz was incredibly abusive because he was Muslim, because he was from the Middle East. He was a very violent individual.
Stop yelling at me.
And he ruled his home with an iron fist.
The prosecution refutes every claim and shines a light on Leah's own behavior.
There was not a single person that had ever seen Ijaz so much as raise his voice or raise a hand or even push Leah away from him.
And prosecutors learn Leah had deceived Ijaz all along.
Leah had failed to tell Ijaz that she was still legally married to Larry.
They only had a Muslim ceremony. I don't know if Leah just said she wasn't concerned about having a marriage license or how that all worked out. There was no legal marriage in the state of Tennessee because they didn't get a marriage license.
Then, after the murder, the prosecution believes Ijaz's remains were still in his house as Leah emptied it over the next 2 weeks.
What we focused on was all the things she did afterwards. That's where it was clear to us that this showed premeditation. Leah couldn't have been in that house and not known that there was a decomposing body there. Not only was the smell permeating the storage shed that he was found in, but the entire house reeked of it.
And Leah wasn't done just yet. Ijaz's rental homes were broken into, and renters' property went missing. Tenants even received termination notices.
One would assume in an attempt to rent them herself so she could get money. Even after 2 weeks, never a time anywhere during that where she even had enough remorse to run away. The fact that she stayed and got every single dime that she could milk out of every single piece of property that Ijaz had showed this was a premeditated act.
Prosecutors believe when Leah turned herself into custody for her parole violations, she expected to spend a few months in prison and would be able to retrieve the items she'd left in the storage unit.
She had prepaid it. She thought that she could spend however long in jail there and then get out and do whatever she had planned on doing.
On November 4th, 2005, Leah Joy Ward is convicted for the first-degree murder of Ijaz Ahmad.
Leah Ward was sentenced automatically to life imprisonment. That is, in Tennessee, a minimum of 51 years.
I was really relieved that she wouldn't be able to do this to anybody else. As they read the verdict, she looked back at me and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." I knew that she was sorry, but I don't believe it was for the right reason. I think she was more sorry for her having to spend the rest of her life in prison.
Ijaz, by all accounts, was an honest, caring, charitable human being. And Leah Ward took advantage of that. And then in the end, she tried to use both his Muslim faith and him being a man to change perceptions and get people to see her as the victim. These actions tell me that Leah Ward is the most cold-hearted, unfeeling person that I've ever dealt with.
Today, the anger is gone, but the wounds are still raw.
Yes, he said he wants so we can go.
I want people to know that Ijaz was the nicest man I've ever met in my life. He was a perfect gentleman all the time, and he was a loving person. And I will always remember him like that.
What I miss most about Ijaz is the way the rest of the world would stop existing. And that it was just me and him, and we could conquer anything together. That stays inside of my heart, and it helps me to focus on the positive energy that flows from our son, Jordan.
The hardest part for me is remembering his presence and not being able to talk to him. I have forgiven Leah because I cannot hold that much hatred with me. It would eat me up. My father didn't believe in holding on to a grudge. I'm following in his footsteps by being the best man that I can be and to create something positive for the world.
By the time the killings that would later be grouped under the Southside Slayer label began to draw wider notice, South Los Angeles had already been carrying too much weight for too long. To understand the world these women moved through, and the atmosphere in which multiple predators were able to operate, it is necessary to step back from the body counts and headlines and look carefully at the city that surrounded them. This was Los Angeles in the 1980s, a place sold to the world as a geography of brightness, glamour, freeways, beaches, and reinvention. But beneath that polished skin were neighborhoods shaped by disinvestment, racial segregation, brittle public services, and a daily struggle that rarely made it into the city's self-portrait. South Los Angeles did not resemble the version of Los Angeles projected on movie screens. It was not designed to flatter the imagination of outsiders. It was a place of small houses behind iron gates, apartment buildings with worn stair rails, storefront churches in converted retail spaces, liquor stores protected by thick glass, bus stops where women stood with grocery bags pressing into their fingers, and streets that could feel both intimate and exposed at the same time. Families lived close together, but so did fear, rumor, and the knowledge that certain dangers were not temporary visitors. They were fixtures. The people who lived there built routines not because life was easy enough to drift through, but because routine was one of the few defenses against chaos. Morning began before dawn for many households. Men left early for work if work could be found. Women rose to get children dressed, prepare food, catch buses, keep appointments, stretch money. Grandmothers watched from porches. Teenagers learned quickly which blocks felt safe and which ones only looked safe from a distance. Every neighborhood has its own weather of feeling, and in South Los Angeles, that weather was often made of caution. Even in daylight, people read streets the way sailors read water. They noticed parked cars, unfamiliar men, broken lights, and the slight but meaningful shift in atmosphere that can turn an ordinary corner into a place to avoid. This caution did not come from paranoia. It came from experience. The years leading into the 1980s had left scars on the community that did not heal simply because a new decade began. Economic decline had narrowed possibilities. Stable jobs that had once given working families a foothold became harder to secure. Factories and industrial employers disappeared or cut back. Money drained away, but the bills did not. Housing remained cramped and precarious for many. Schools were under strain. Public infrastructure looked tired and neglected, as if the city had quietly decided that some districts could be left to endure with less. People adapted because people always do, but adaptation is not the same thing as relief. Survival in an environment like this demanded inventiveness, pride, patience, and sometimes a silence that looked to outsiders like resignation. It was not resignation. It was exhaustion sharpened into discipline. The women who would later become part of this story lived inside that reality, and many of them stood at the intersection of several forms of vulnerability at once. They were poor, or close enough to poverty that a missed payment or a bad week could rearrange everything. Many were black women, moving through a society that had long treated black women's suffering as both familiar and easy to dismiss. Some were involved in sex work, some struggled with addiction. Some moved between homes, streets, temporary arrangements, and unstable relationships. None of these facts made them less human, but each one placed them in greater danger in a city where visibility did not guarantee protection, and where stigma could function like a second threat layered over the first. The wider culture was quick to moralize about women living on the margins, and much slower to ask what had pushed them there. Behind every simplified description was usually a chain of pressures: childhood instability, violence at home, untreated trauma, poverty, abandonment, racism, lack of access to treatment, the burden of caring for others while barely surviving oneself. The distance between a woman standing in line at a grocery store with her children and a woman negotiating with strangers on the street at midnight was not always as wide as respectable society liked to pretend. Sometimes it was a matter of months, a job lost, a beating endured, a habit formed to dull pain, a landlord refusing patience, a boyfriend who became a threat, a system with no soft landing for a woman already slipping. In South Los Angeles, many residents understood that instinctively because they had lived close enough to hardship to know how quickly life could tilt. The 1980s also brought the devastating acceleration of the crack cocaine epidemic, which moved through already vulnerable communities with brutal speed. What had been fragile became unstable. Corners that once belonged mostly to neighborhood life took on a different rhythm. Deals happened in plain sight. Violence became more unpredictable. People who had once held themselves together through low-paying jobs, church networks, and family support found those supports weakening under pressure. Addiction changed daily life not only for the people using drugs, but for children, siblings, parents, partners, neighbors, and entire blocks. It changed the sound of the night, the mood of apartment stairwells, The tension in family conversations, the way money vanished, the way trust thinned out. It also changed who could move through the streets without drawing notice. Predators thrive where confusion and disorder already exist. A woman in distress, a woman under the influence, a woman trying to make enough money to get through the night, a woman estranged from her family or simply absent from them for a few days, could be targeted in ways that were harder for institutions to track quickly. When multiple women disappeared or were found murdered under those conditions, the patterns should have triggered sustained alarm. But in neighborhoods accustomed to being overpoliced in some ways and underprotected in others, the response often felt uneven, slow, and emotionally detached. That contradiction shaped daily life. Residents could be stopped, searched, watched, and suspected with great efficiency, yet when they needed urgent protection, they often felt invisible. Police presence was not the same as public safety. In fact, for many black residents of South Los Angeles, the relationship with law enforcement was burdened by mistrust long before these murders came into focus. That mistrust had history behind it. Policing in black neighborhoods had often emphasized containment and force rather than care or partnership. People learned to be careful not only around criminals, but around the system supposedly designed to protect them. This did not mean no one wanted the murders solved. It meant many families approached the authorities with a complicated mix of hope, anger, fear, and skepticism. They wanted answers, but they also knew from experience that some victims were treated as more urgent than others. They knew that a middle-class girl missing from a different neighborhood could become the subject of immediate public concern, while a poor black woman with a record, an addiction, or a reputation the press found convenient might receive less sympathy from the start. That knowledge sat heavily in the background of every new report. Media coverage intensified the divide. The language used to describe the women often carried a distancing effect. Their lives were compressed into shorthand. Their vulnerabilities were foregrounded in a way that sometimes suggested inevitability rather than tragedy. The emphasis on prostitution, drugs, and the rough edges of street life made it easier for audiences outside the neighborhood to process the murders as part of some grim but familiar underworld instead of as a moral emergency requiring equal outrage. This was one of the cruelest dimensions of the context. Violence against marginalized women was not merely happening in a neglected landscape. It was also being filtered through a public vocabulary that could strip them of complexity. A woman was transformed from daughter, mother, sister, friend, churchgoer, runaway survivor, or dreamer into a category. Once a human being is converted into a category, pity becomes conditional. Attention becomes thinner, delay becomes easier to tolerate. The women in these cases did not live as categories. They lived in rooms scented with cooking oil and hairspray and stale cigarette smoke. They laughed in kitchens, borrowed money, argued with relatives, carried old grudges, remembered songs, worried about children, and made promises to themselves they did not always have the strength to keep. They were not all alike, and the neighborhood knew that. South Los Angeles itself was not a single mood or uniform landscape either. It contained blocks where people still swept sidewalks each morning, where neighbors knew one another's nicknames, where women exchanged recipes and warnings in the same breath. It contained schools, beauty salons, churches, mechanic shops, corner stores, and front yards where children played beneath laundry lines. There was pride there, and style, and humor, and a hard-earned elegance in the way people carried themselves even when life had offered very little softness. Music poured from windows. Sundays had their own pace. Weddings, funerals, backyard parties, and church revivals stitched the community together. This matters because stories like this are often told as if violence completely defines a place. It does not. Violence enters an existing world. It wounds a living community. It interrupts lives already full of texture. In the early and middle years of the decade, that texture coexisted with a thickening sense of vulnerability. Women who walked at night developed mental maps of danger. Families set unspoken curfews. Men who cared for sisters, daughters, mothers, and girlfriends tried to offer rides when they could, but not everyone had a car, and not every risk could be managed. Public transportation stretched distances into long waits, side streets darkened early, street lights failed and stayed broken, people watched strangers more carefully. Women sometimes traveled together for a stretch and then split apart at the point where one block became another person's private fear. There was also the matter of how quickly stories traveled when formal channels seemed insufficient. Word of mouth was powerful. A woman not seen for several days could become the subject of concern long before a report acquired bureaucratic gravity. Neighbors noticed absences because poor communities often rely on human observation more than institutions realize. A familiar face missing from a bus stop, a friend failing to return to an apartment, a daughter not calling, these small ruptures registered quickly among people who were used to paying attention. Yet once such cases passed into the machinery of official investigation, they could encounter all the old obstacles: incomplete records, delayed recognition of patterns, assumptions about lifestyle, fragmented jurisdictions, and the simple fact that when many marginalized women are victimized in overlapping ways, the wider system often struggles or refuses to see them with clarity. This was the world in which the phrase South Side Slayer eventually emerged, and its emergence says something important about the public appetite for crime narratives. A label like that offers drama and coherence. It packages fear into something legible. It suggests one enemy moving with a singular method through the city's darkness. But the reality was more fragmented, and therefore more disturbing. Multiple offenders targeted vulnerable women in overlapping geography and time. The label disguised that complexity, and in doing so it reflected another tendency of the era: to simplify violence against poor black women into a lurid pattern rather than confront the broader social conditions that made such women easier to prey upon. Even the word slayer carried a sensational edge, as if the victims existed inside a pulp narrative rather than in a community where families waited up with porch lights on. The context, then, was not only physical or economic, it was symbolic. It involved who was considered grievable, who was worth sustained empathy, and how language itself can obscure as much as it reveals. For black women in particular, the burden was doubled. They moved through a society that routinely demanded strength from them while offering too little protection in return. Their pain could be normalized, their anger dismissed, their vulnerability read as failure rather than evidence of structural cruelty. In South Los Angeles, black women kept households together, held families through crisis, worked jobs that did not pay enough, stood in welfare lines, prayed over children, navigated men's expectations, and endured the constant low-grade pressure of being expected to absorb more than anyone should have to absorb. When some of those women fell into addiction or sex work, the moral judgment of the outside world arrived faster than any meaningful support. When some of them were murdered, that judgment lingered in the atmosphere around their deaths. And yet within the neighborhood many people understood the women more intimately than any official description could. They knew which woman still loved old soul ballads, which one brought jokes into a room, which one had once braided every little girl's hair on the block, which one had been bright in school before life bent her sideways, which one still visited her mother when she could, which one had children tucked into relatives' homes while she tried, and failed, and tried again to straighten herself out. That intimate knowledge created a second reality beneath the public story, one in which every victim remained specific. It is in that gap between public flattening and private memory that the real context of these cases lies. The city above was loud with headlines, sirens, patrol cars, and political rhetoric. The city below was quieter and more truthful. It lived in kitchens where women spoke in tired voices after midnight, in apartments where rent money was hidden in coffee cans, in church pews where prayer names multiplied, in beauty parlors where gossip and grief braided together, and in the fearful glances exchanged when another body was rumored to have been found. South Los Angeles was not waiting for the world to discover its suffering. It was already living with it. The murders that would later be grouped together did not erupt into a blank landscape. They entered a place already marked by an equal power, by a hierarchy of attention, and by the daily ingenuity of people forced to survive inside both. That is the context in which Part 1's atmosphere of dread took shape. Not in abstraction, but in a real neighborhood where women moved through danger because they had to, where families loved imperfectly but fiercely, where institutions inspired too little trust, and where the distance between being seen and being protected could be as wide as a city that preferred some of its daughters to remain in shadow. If there is a single wound at the center of the South Side Slayer story, it is this: the women who were killed were too often spoken about only after violence had already erased their voices. And even then, they were described from the outside, by police summaries, newspaper shorthand, neighborhood rumor, and the cold convenience of labels. But a life is not best understood from the outline left after death. A life is understood from the inside, from the private logic that carries a woman through one more day, from the memories she keeps, from the compromises she hates making, from the small acts of dignity she performs when no one is watching. In a case like this, where several men preyed upon women who already stood near the edge of society's compassion, the victim's statement cannot belong to a single person alone. It must rise from many lives at once, from many rooms, many sidewalks, many nights, many mothers and daughters and sisters and women who were seen only in pieces by the wider world. It must sound like a chorus broken apart by fear and stitched back together by memory. It begins long before the city notices the bodies. It begins in childhood bedrooms where girls once slept under thin blankets and woke to radios playing softly in the next room. It begins in kitchens where a mother's hands moved through flour, hot grease, dishwater, laundry soap, and unpaid worry. It begins in the place where a girl first learns how to carry herself in a world already measuring her too harshly. Some of these women had once been little girls with ribbons in their hair, standing on church steps in polished shoes, or running down cracked sidewalks in school uniforms gone slightly frayed at the edges. Some were stubborn children, quick to laugh, quick to flare up, quick to dream beyond the limits of the blocks that held them. Some were quiet, the kind who watched adults closely and learned early that survival often depended on sensing danger before it spoke aloud. Some grew up in crowded apartments full of family noise, where privacy was rare but loneliness was delayed by constant company. Some grew up in homes where tenderness arrived inconsistently, where love was mixed with violence, addiction, exhaustion, or absence, and where girlhood ended not with age, but with the first demand that they endure more than a child should have to endure. If they could speak now in one merged and human voice, the first thing they might say is that none of them began where the newspapers found them. None of them began in a mug shot, a vice report, a police file, an alley, a motel room, or an autopsy photograph. They began in the ordinary places of human becoming. They were born into names. They were held, someone counted their fingers, someone looked at them and imagined a future. That future may have narrowed as years passed, but it was once as open and bright as anyone else's. They might say that poverty has a way of changing how the world reads a woman's face. Once hardship becomes visible, strangers begin inventing explanations. They look at addiction and refuse to see pain beneath it. They look at sex work and refuse to see the long staircase of forces that led there. They look at a woman who has been living too close to danger for too long and imagine that danger now belongs naturally to her, as if suffering were a chosen language. But from inside the life, it never feels that simple. Inside the life there are always sequences, moments, causes, efforts, collapses, recoveries, bad luck, betrayals, needs. A woman does not wake one morning and step cleanly into ruin. She is edged toward it by hunger, by men, by fear, by the need to pay rent, by a habit that grew from a wand, by a family argument that became estrangement, by a child she is trying not to lose, by a job that disappeared, by a landlord who would not wait, by the shame of asking for help too many times, by the humiliating arithmetic of survival. These women might say that many people knew fragments of them and mistook fragments for the whole. A mother knew the child who still existed somewhere beneath the hardened voice and the late hours. A sister knew the girl who once stole her blouse and danced in the mirror. A friend knew the way she could still make a whole room laugh when she wanted to. A child knew her smell, the touch of her hand, the way she hummed without noticing. A pastor might have remembered the bowed head, the promise to come back next Sunday. A man on the street might have known only her price, her caution, her impatience, her exhaustion. A police officer might have known her as another troubled woman on another troubled block. A reporter might have known only enough to reduce her to a type. None of those people, standing alone, possessed the full truth. The full truth lived in the movement between these versions, in the distance between the child and the woman, and the way both could still exist in the same body. They might say that fear was not new to them, even before the men who killed them entered the story. Fear had already lived in their apartments, in the fists of boyfriends, in the silence after unpaid bills, in the watchfulness required on certain corners, in the sound of footsteps behind them at night, in the weight of craving, in the risk of every transaction with a stranger. Women living this close to the edge develop a layered awareness. They know when a car slows too carefully. They know when an offer is really a test. They know how to scan a face for impatience, cruelty, drunkenness, need. They know the difference between a man who is nearly buying and a man who is studying. They know that nighttime has textures, that one block can feel survivable and the next can feel like a trap. They know how to keep walking while appearing calm. They know how to smile without yielding trust. They know how to tuck fear behind the eyes and continue anyway, because continuing is sometimes the only available option. If they could speak, they might say that exhaustion can be more dangerous than innocence. It is not always naivete that gets a woman killed. Sometimes it is the simple wearing down of vigilance. A woman has been awake too long. She is hungry. She needs money tonight, not tomorrow. Her body aches. She tells herself, this customer looks ordinary enough. This ride will be short. This risk feels no worse than the dozen others already survived. She bargains with dread because she has done it before. She enters a car because the alternative is sleeping outside, going home empty-handed, facing withdrawal, facing another morning with nothing. From outside, people ask why she got in. From inside, the question sounds different. From inside, the real question is why so many conditions had already aligned to make that choice feel possible, even necessary. They might say they were not asking the world for sainthood. They were asking for recognition. Recognition that pain distorts judgment. Recognition that addiction is not moral theater, but a cage built one day at a time. Recognition that some women stand in dangerous places not because they are drawn to danger, but because safer places have repeatedly closed their doors. Recognition that black women, especially poor black women, are too often expected to absorb every form of neglect and still remain graceful enough to deserve sympathy. They might say that many of them were tired of being treated as cautionary tales rather than as people. A cautionary tale has no interior life. It exists only to instruct someone else. But these women had interior lives crowded with hope and regret and memory. One wanted to get clean. One had already said she was done with the streets and meant it, at least for that afternoon. One was trying to get enough money together to see her children. One still carried the habit of smoothing her hair before stepping into a room. One still hated thunderstorms. One still dreamed of a small place of her own with curtains she chose herself. One still wanted her mother to say she had not given up on her. These are not grand ambitions, but they are deeply human ones, and human beings do not become less human because their lives have become difficult to narrate. If they could speak in this section, perhaps they would not speak first of death at all. Perhaps they would speak of being looked at. There is a difference between being seen and being looked at. Being seen means someone registers your existence with depth. Being looked at can mean measurement, suspicion, appraisal, contempt, desire stripped of care. Many of these women moved through a world that looked at them constantly and saw them rarely. Men looked at their bodies. Police looked at their records. Reporters looked at their lifestyles. Social systems looked at their failures. But who saw the cumulative damage, the tenderness half buried under defense, the stubbornness that kept them alive longer than anyone expected, the humiliations they survived before the final one? A victim's statement, if one could be gathered from all of them, would insist on that missing sight. It would ask to be read not from the point of disappearance, but from the long corridor leading there. It would ask the listener to stand in a cheap room at dawn with makeup half removed, feet aching, stomach empty, mind racing through bills and apologies, and the promise to do better tomorrow. It would ask the listener to sit beside a mother waiting for a daughter, who is always late but not usually this late. It would ask the listener to smell the old perfume still lingering in a borrowed coat, to hear the click of high heels on uneven pavement, to feel the false confidence a woman wears because there is no practical use in displaying fear to men who might exploit it. It would say that the streets did not swallow these women whole in one bite. The streets wore them down, negotiated with them, punished them, seduced them with immediate answers to impossible questions, and then placed them in the path of men who understood exactly how little protection surrounded them. They might also say that even among suffering there was style. This matters. Poor women, black women, women dismissed as ruined or reckless, still cultivated beauty. Lipstick applied in a cracked mirror, hoop earrings fastened with practice hands, nails painted on a friend's couch, a wig adjusted just right, perfume dabbed at the throat, a blouse chosen because it made the shoulders look strong. Beauty in such circumstances is not vanity. It is resistance, armor, a private argument against erasure. To prepare oneself in this way before stepping into a dangerous night is to insist, however quietly, that the world has not fully stripped away personhood. If the victims could speak, perhaps they would want that included too, not because glamour softens violence, but because dignity survives in details. They might say the city misunderstood silence. Just because a woman had stopped explaining herself did not mean she had no story left. Just because family ties had frayed did not mean love had vanished. Just because she walked alone at 2 a.m. did not mean she belonged to the dark. Some of them had been trying to come back from very far away. Some were still falling. Some alternated between those two conditions day by day. A victim's statement must hold both truths: vulnerability and agency, damage and desire, poor choices and constrained options. To flatten them into perfect innocence would be another form of dishonesty, but to deny their humanity because they were flawed would be worse. They were flawed in the ordinary human sense and in the harsher sense produced by deprivation. They lied sometimes, borrowed money they could not repay, relapsed, disappeared for days, hurt people who loved them, returned ashamed, left again, swore they were finished, and sometimes meant it. None of this made them available for slaughter. None of this turned murder into background noise. If they could speak directly to the audience of this story, they might ask for one difficult thing: do not separate our deaths from the conditions of our lives. But do not reduce our lives to those conditions either. Hold both. Understand the street, the drugs, the hunger, the racism, the danger, the institutional neglect. But also remember the laugh, the church dress, the stubborn streak, the baby photo, the cheap perfume, the old argument with a sister, the wish to be forgiven, the dream of rest. Remember, that even women who had learned to survive through caution could still be caught by violence because predators seek exactly those whom society has already taught itself not to defend vigorously enough. Remember that no one deserves to be studied more closely in death than they were cared for in life. And perhaps most of all, they would ask not to be merged so completely that individuality disappears again. The irony of the South Side Slayer cases is that the women were grouped in death under one sensational phrase after being isolated in life by poverty, addiction, stigma, and neglect. A proper victim statement pushes against both distortions. It says each woman belonged to herself before she belonged to any narrative. She was singular. She may have shared circumstances with others, but she did not share a soul, a voice, a set of memories, or a face in the mirror. She had one life, and that life, however frayed, was the center of a world to someone. So the statement closes not as evidence, but as a plea against forgetting we were here before the headlines. We carried our own histories in our bodies. We were not born into the names that later reduced us. We walked through a hard city under harder judgments, and still found ways to laugh, dress ourselves, comfort our children, disappoint our families, long for better things, and wake up again after nights that should have broken us. We were vulnerable, but vulnerability is not consent. We were struggling, but struggle is not destiny. We were seen imperfectly, but we were loved more deeply than the public ever knew. Tell the story with that weight in it. Tell it so that when the violence arrives, it falls not on faceless women in a series, but on human beings whose absence leaves a shape that cannot be filled. The incident did not happen once. That is the first terrible truth of this chapter. It happened again and again, beneath different skies, in different cars, behind different doors, on different patches of ground where the city had already taught itself not to linger too long. When people later spoke of the South Side Slayer cases, they often reached for the grammar of a single eruption, as though one nightmare had descended whole upon South Los Angeles, and then moved through it with a single mind. But the real incident was more diffuse, and therefore more frightening. It was a repeated collision between vulnerability and predation, between women forced by circumstance into dangerous visibility and men who recognized exactly how much room the world had left for violence to hide. The incident, if it is to be told honestly, must be understood not as one scene but as a pattern of scenes, each one beginning in the ordinary exhaustion of evening and ending in a silence that would spread outward through families, neighborhoods, police files, and eventually the public memory of the city. Night after night, South Los Angeles arranged itself into the conditions that made these crimes possible. Storefronts dimmed, traffic thinned, then surged, then thinned again. Headlights dragged white bars across stucco walls and chain-link fences. Streetlights hummed above corners where women waited, walked, negotiated, or hesitated. Radios played behind half-open windows. Somewhere, a couple argued with the weary anger of people who had run out of gentleness hours earlier. Somewhere else, children were being told to go to sleep while adults remained awake, listening to the city continue its restless breathing outside. On certain blocks the air carried the layered smell of heat still trapped in concrete, of stale beer, gasoline, fried food, damp cardboard, perfume, cigarette smoke, and the metallic edge that seems to rise from pavement after midnight. There was nothing theatrical about it. That is what made it dangerous. The city did not look like a crime scene in advance. It looked like a city enduring itself. And within that entrance, women moved through necessity. Some were trying to earn enough to get through the night. Some were looking for a room, a fix, a ride, a customer, a familiar face. Some were already frayed by hours without sleep, by hunger, by drugs, by the accumulated burden of being watched and judged and wanted and used all at once. They stood under streetlights that made every face seem more tired. They leaned into car windows, pulled back, leaned in again. They walked with the measured posture of women who had long ago learned how to appear neither too fearful nor too available. They read men quickly because they had to. The shape of a hand on a steering wheel, the set of the jaw, whether the voice was too smooth, too urgent, too drunk, too quiet. Survival often came down to instant calculations made in dim light. But survival is not science. It is improvisation under pressure, and pressure distorts instinct. Somewhere inside the repeated incidents that make up this chapter, there is always a moment that would look small from a distance. A woman pauses before opening a car door. A man says something meant to reassure her. The dome light inside the vehicle flickers on and turns both their faces briefly and real. She sees something ordinary enough to proceed. Maybe she notices nothing at all. Maybe she notices a trace of danger and decides she has handled that kind before. Maybe she is too tired to keep refusing. Maybe she needs money tonight more than she needs certainty. Maybe she believes the transaction will be short. Maybe she believes she can still step away if necessary. The incident begins there, not at the final act of violence, but at the instant a choice narrows under bad conditions until it no longer feels like a choice in the full sense. The car pulls away from the curb. Tires cross intersections already forgotten by the rest of the city. Music or silence fills the space between them. Outside, neighborhoods slide past in fragments. Dark lawns, boarded windows, fluorescent liquor stores, alley mouths, chain link glinting under weak light. Telephone poles nailed with old notices lifting at the corners. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere changes by degree. A man who seemed calm becomes watchful in a different way. A tone hardens. A wrong turn is taken and explained too casually. A hand moves faster than expected. Or perhaps nothing obvious changes at first. Perhaps he remains polite. That is the cruelty of such encounters. Violence does not always announce itself early enough to avoid. Some men carry danger the way other men carry cologne, close to the skin, detectable only when it is too late. A woman accustomed to negotiating with strangers might keep her voice steady, ask where they are going, make a joke, test the tension, prepare to insist on terms. But there comes a moment in every such encounter when instinct sends up a flare inside the body. A silent recognition that the rules have shifted, and that the man beside her is no longer participating in the ordinary rituals of exchange. He is no longer buying time, company, a body, or a service. He is moving toward possession. And once a man begins to think in the language of possession, everything inside the car changes. The locks become louder. The windows feel farther away. The seat seems to hold her in place. The body registers danger before the mind can fully arrange it. The heart beats harder. The muscles tighten. The voice, if it rises, may still be bargaining long after the situation has moved beyond bargaining. In some versions of the incident, the destination is a vacant lot, a side street, an alley, a darkened driveway, a place chosen because it lies just beyond the range of ordinary interruption. In others, it is a room, an apartment, a structure that appears temporary or abandoned from outside and becomes final once the door closes. The city contains countless spaces where harm can be committed within earshot of other lives and still go unanswered. A television turned up too loud, a family too tired to investigate a thud, a neighbor who hears a cry and decides it belongs to a domestic quarrel they cannot safely enter. Urban violence often depends on this ecology of partial witnessing. Somebody hears something. Nobody sees enough. Fear edits memory before the police ever arrive. The incident unfolds in such a space, under the pressure of male force and female resistance, that may be fierce, brief, exhausted, strategic, or all at once. It is important not to romanticize struggle. A woman fighting for her life does not look cinematic. She looks desperate, stunned, furious, disbelieving, then animal with the need to survive. Her nails scrape, her legs kick, her breath breaks into panic. She may plead, curse, bargain, threaten to remember his face, promise silence, invoke God, invoke children, invoke a mother waiting at home, invoke any thread of humanity she hopes remains in him. But some men are most themselves at the moment another person becomes afraid. They lean closer. Their eyes do not soften. Their voices may become colder or stranger or eerily calm. Violence of this kind is not only physical domination, it is a psychological unveiling. It reveals a void where empathy should have been. And because the women targeted in these incidents were often already burdened by stigma, the men who attacked them could act with the confidence of those who suspect the world will be slow to care. There is a particular horror in being harmed by someone who is counting on your disposability. That horror belongs to this chapter as much as the physical act itself. Across the cluster of cases, the incidents carried different signatures because the offenders were not one man. That distinction matters, yet from the perspective of the women in those final moments, the pattern would have felt grimly similar. A stranger or near stranger, and narrowing of options. A shift from transaction to menace, sudden force, isolation, then the violent logic of a man determined to erase resistance and leave behind as little immediate consequence for himself as possible. In some cases, the women's bodies would later show evidence of sexual assault, beating, strangulation, gunfire, or other methods of control and murder. In narrative terms, it may be tempting to linger on such specifics for shock, but the deeper truth lies in what those methods express. They express contempt. They express the confidence of men who see these women not as people but as targets within a landscape already thinned of protection. They express a citywide failure that allowed multiple predators to identify the same pool of vulnerability and act on it. The incident, then, is not merely the private encounter between killer and victim. It is also the unseen accompaniment of everything surrounding that encounter, the broken systems, the thin public empathy, the media habits that would later distort the facts, the old racial and economic hierarchies that made some deaths seem easier to overlook than others. Meanwhile, outside the immediate scene of violence, life continues with almost unbearable indifference. A bus exhales at a stop a few blocks away. Someone laughs on a porch, ice shifts in a glass. A patrol car cruises another avenue without knowing what is happening nearby. A mother glances at the clock and decides to wait 10 more minutes before worrying in earnest. A sister turns over in bed. A child wakes briefly, then sleeps again. This is one of the cruelest features of homicide. It divides time. In one hidden place the world has already changed forever, while everywhere else the night keeps moving in its ordinary sequence of minor events. By the time alarm spreads, if it spreads quickly at all, the violence is over, the man has left or is leaving, the body is cooling in darkness. The city has not paused to mark the threshold between before and after. The incident also extends beyond the moment of death because disappearance itself can be part of the violence. For some of these women, the first sign that something was wrong was not the discovery of a body but a gap in routine. She did not return. She did not call. She was not at the corner where she was usually seen. She did not come by for money, for food, for an argument, for one more apology. In neighborhoods where instability was common, absence could be misread for a time. A woman might stay away for days without immediate official concern, especially if she had a history of addiction, sex work, drifting, or conflict with family. That ambiguity provided cover. Families felt it as a slow tightening in the chest. At first, perhaps, irritation, then unease, then the sharper dread that arrives when delay itself becomes evidence. A mother sits on the edge of a bed and stares at the phone. A sister walks to a neighbor's apartment to ask if anyone has seen her. A friend checks the usual places and returns with that helpless shake of the head which, in these communities, can say more than a paragraph. The incident lives there too in the hours when uncertainty becomes its own torment. If the woman is later found, then the private violence enters public space, yellow tape, flashlights, murmured speculation, detectives with tired faces, reporters if the case has gathered enough notice. The body, once hidden, becomes subject to procedure. Yet even then, the original violence is not fully over because another transformation begins, the transformation of a woman into a case. The details of the scene are recorded. The clothing is described, the injuries are catalogued. Her life is compressed into identifiers useful to the investigation. This is necessary, but it is also one more way the incident ripples outward. A woman who died in terror is now translated into evidence. Family members, when notified, must absorb the unbearable alchemy by which someone they love becomes a subject of forensic interest. They must hear factual language applied to a person whose childhood they remember in sunlight. They must answer questions when they can barely breathe. They must confront not only death but the suspicion, judgment, or indifference that can shadow certain victims from the very start. In the South Side Slayer cases, because the victims were so often poor black women and many were associated with sex work or addiction, the incident did not arrive before the public on equal terms with more socially favored tragedies. It came burdened by implication. People asked what she was doing there, who she was with, whether she used drugs, whether she had arrests, whether she had been trying to sell sex. All of this could be true and still mean nothing in the face of murder, but in practice such details altered the moral temperature on the case. The dead woman was subtly repositioned from innocent harmed by evil to risky person caught in danger, as if the second framing made outrage less urgent. That cultural reflex is itself part of the incident because it determines how forcefully a city responds. A murder committed against a woman the public has already half abandoned is easier for the killer to imagine and for institutions to mishandle. So part for must end not with a neat climax, but with the recognition that the incident was cumulative. Each act of violence struck an individual woman in a private and final way, yet together these crimes formed a pattern that exposed something rotten in the civic soul of Los Angeles during that era. The women entered the night carrying hunger, hope, fear, habit, fatigue, and whatever scraps of dignity they still guarded. The men who approached them carried opportunity sharpened into predation. Somewhere between curbside conversation and isolated violence, the ordinary roughness of the streets gave way to something colder, more intentional, more lethal. And when the night was over, what remained was not only another dead woman or another vanished one, but another proof that in certain parts of the city, under certain conditions, a life could be cornered, crushed, and nearly folded into silence before the wider world decided it was worth truly seeing. The crime scene, in cases like these, rarely announces itself with the dramatic clarity people imagine from films. It does not arrive already arranged into revelation. It is first encountered as interruption, a body where no body should be, a shape in weeds. A woman lying too still in a vacant lot while the city continues on her with that terrible composure cities possess. As if concrete and sunlight and traffic have made a pact never to stop for individual suffering. Morning often makes such discoveries crueler. At night, darkness conceals. By daylight, everything becomes legible at once. The flattened grass, the litter pressed into dirt, the imprint of tires, the angle of limbs too deliberate or too broken to be mistaken for sleep, a shoe several feet away, a purse missing, jewelry still present or stripped away, bruises beginning to tell their story in color, fabric twisted, skin exposed to air that is already warming, flies arriving before witnesses can compose themselves. The first eyes on the scene are not always trained eyes. Sometimes it is a sanitation worker, a passerby, a child taking a shortcut where no child should be alone, a resident cutting through a lot because it saves 10 minutes, a man on his way to work who sees something wrong in the landscape and tries, at first, to explain it away. There is almost always a brief moment of refusal, the human mind's last effort to avoid recognition. A pile of clothes, a mannequin, someone passed out, then the shape resolves, and the world divides. Before that instant, The morning belonged to errands and fatigue and ordinary irritation. After it, the whole block begins to tilt toward a single point. Someone backs away. Someone curses softly. Someone runs for a phone. Someone stands frozen, staring, as if movement itself would certify the reality too soon. By the time police arrive, the scene has already absorbed those first circles of human reaction, shock stirring the air as tangibly as dust. South Los Angeles in the 1980s contained no shortage of neglected spaces where a killer could leave a woman and trust that discovery might be delayed or, worse, interpreted through indifference. Vacant lots, alleys, abandoned structures, side streets with poor lighting, patches of scrub beside industrial zones, dead ends that gathered trash and silence. All of them formed a secondary map beneath the official city grid, a map of places overlooked just enough to be useful to men with violent intent. These were not empty places in the moral sense. They sat near homes, churches, schools, bus routes, corner stores. People passed them every day, but neglect changes the social meaning of geography. When a place is allowed to decay, it quietly becomes a container for what the broader city does not want to see. Dumped furniture, broken glass, syringes, beer bottles, burned debris, stray dogs nosing through refuse, and sometimes a body. That is what made the early crime scene so devastating. The women were not found in landscapes untouched by human life. They were found in landscapes shaped by abandonment, where violence could settle without immediately forcing institutional attention. The first official impressions at a crime scene often depend on the body itself, because the body carries the clearest evidence that a crime, not merely a death, has occurred. In these cases, the women's remains frequently bore signs of more than one assault upon dignity. Clothing was disturbed or missing. There were indications of sexual violence, restraint, beating, strangulation, sometimes gunshot wounds, sometimes injuries suggesting panic and resistance. Each wound, bruise, tear, and mark existed not only as physical evidence, but as a record of a struggle the victim had lost in private. And yet forensic meaning is rarely obvious in the first moments. An experienced investigator might kneel, scan the ground, note lividity, notice whether rigor suggests the body was left recently or had lain there through the night, study the position of the hands, the distribution of dirt, the abrasions on knees or elbows, the presence or absence of drag marks. But even careful observation begins in uncertainty. Was she killed here or brought here after death? Was the body posed or simply discarded without care? Did the victim know the assailant well enough to enter a car or room voluntarily before violence began? Was robbery incidental or staged? Is the lack of identification a coup or a routine consequence of the kind of vulnerable street life in which possessions are often unstable, lost, traded, or stolen? These questions hover over the scene before they become lines in a report. The crime scene itself answers slowly, and often only in fragments. For on the body, the ground becomes a text investigators try to read before weather traffic, neighborhood curiosity, and simple time begin erasing the smaller letters. Tire tracks might suggest a vehicle but not whose. Shoe prints may overlap with older impressions left by unrelated passersby. Cigarette butts, bottles, condoms, wrappers, and scraps of paper might be meaningful or might belong to the ordinary debris field of an already misused urban lot. In better protected, less chaotic spaces, evidence stands out more sharply. In neglected spaces, everything is contaminated by context. Trash resembles clues. Clues resemble trash. A torn piece of fabric caught on wire might matter deeply or not at all. A strand of hair could belong to the victim, the killer, or someone who crossed the lot days earlier. In neighborhoods where people move through these areas regularly, and where police presence could mean trouble rather than safety, bystanders were not always eager to remain and assist. Some watched from porches, some stepped back behind curtains, some offered what they had seen only if pressed. Fear, distrust, and the instinct for self-preservation blurred the perimeter on every scene. The initial clues then were both present and fragile. There was the body itself, always the most immediate testimony. There was the location, suggesting the killer's comfort with abandoned or semi-abandoned urban spaces. There was the victim profile that began, case by case, to emerge in police consciousness. Women vulnerable by race, poverty, addiction, sex work, or some combination of these. There was the repeated geography of South Los Angeles, where bodies turned up in areas already coded by the city as marginal. There were the injuries, which hinted at sexual sadism, control, or rage, though not always in the same configuration because the cases later grouped together did not all originate from one offender. And there was the most elusive clue of all, the atmosphere of pattern. Pattern does not arrive as evidence bagged and labeled. It arrives as unease in the minds of detectives, beat officers, coroners, reporters, and community members who begin to recognize repetition before they can fully prove it. Another woman, another black woman, another poor woman, another woman living close to the street, another body left where the city might look only after it had no choice. The early scenes taught police something essential even before the full complexity of multiple offenders was understood. Whoever was doing this, or whoever among several men was doing versions of this, was selecting victims from the same landscape of vulnerability. Yet even that recognition carried danger, because pattern can mislead as easily as it clarifies. Once investigators begin to group cases, details that do not fit may be ignored, forced into similarity, or treated as noise. This would become part of the larger tragedy later. But at the scene itself, before the label hardened, each body was still singular, and each set of clues had to be read with care. The condition of the victim could indicate whether she had fought hard, whether the attack escalated quickly, whether strangulation suggested intimate control, whether ligature marks pointed to planning, whether a gunshot implied efficiency or panic, whether post-mortem concealment was attempted or not attempted at all. Some killers hide bodies from shame or fear, others display them through indifference, contempt, or the belief that the victim's social status makes discovery less dangerous to the offender. In the South Side cases, the frequent abandonment of bodies in open or semi-open urban spaces suggested a chilling confidence. The killer or killers were operating in an environment where the women's deaths did not seem to threaten immediate, overwhelming scrutiny. That fact is not a forensic detail in the narrow sense, but it is a clue in the larger moral sense. A criminal's behavior is shaped not only by inner compulsion but by what he believes the world will tolerate. Another initial clue lay in the tension between sexual violence and disposability. These were not accidental deaths hidden awkwardly after the fact. The scenes and the injuries often indicated domination followed by abandonment. A woman had been used, overpowered, and then left in a place chosen less for concealment than for neglect. That difference matters. Concealment implies fear of detection. Neglect relies on the landscape and on society's uneven distribution of attention to do part of the concealing. A body in a canyon near a wealthy enclave would have one kind of narrative force. A body in a vacant South Los Angeles lot had another. The killer could trust the scene itself to absorb some of the shock. He could trust the victim's status to reduce the urgency with which strangers demanded answers. That, too, was written into the crime scenes, though not in dust or blood. It was written into placement. The presence or absence of identification became especially significant in some cases. Many women living precariously did not always carry stable personal documents, and belongings could be stolen long before death. Yet when a victim could not be quickly named, her vulnerability deepened even after death. She became a Jane Doe for a time, and that interval of namelessness widened the emotional distance between the case and the public. For detectives, however, namelessness also narrowed the path of inquiry. Without immediate identification, reconstructing the woman's final hours became harder. Family could not yet be interviewed. Friends could not yet say what clothing she wore last, what fears she had voiced, what corner she usually worked, what men had been asking for her, what debts she owed, what routines had been broken. Until a name was restored, the scene remained partially mute. A nameless body tells police how violence ended. It tells them much less about how the victim entered the killer's orbit. The coroner's role became crucial here, because the autopsy extended the crime scene inward, beneath skin, through tissue, into the silent anatomy of what had been done. Time of death might be approximated, sexual assault might be confirmed, internal hemorrhaging could show force beyond what the surface revealed. Trace evidence could survive in hair, under fingernails, in fibers adhering to clothing or skin. But the autopsy, for all its importance, also emphasized one of the bleakest facts of the investigation. By the time the woman arrived on a metal table, the city already knew her body more intimately than it had cared to know her life. This is part of what made the initial clues feel both invaluable and insufficient. They told investigators about violence, but not yet enough about the men. In neighborhoods where word traveled quickly, community knowledge sometimes functioned as a parallel evidence system. Women on the street heard things. They noticed cars. They remembered men whose interest felt wrong, too intense, too quiet, too eager to control where the encounter happened. They knew which customers had rough reputations, which ones carried weapons, which ones liked to drive women far from the usual areas. Friends of the victims might recall the last person seen with her, the make of a vehicle, the nickname of a man who had been around too often. Yet extracting such information depended on trust, and trust was not easy to come by. A woman engaged in sex work or using drugs might hesitate to speak to police for fear of arrest, harassment, or retaliation. A resident might worry that providing information would bring the killer's attention or disturb a fragile peace with the police. So the crime scenes contained one set of clues in the physical world and another set circulating socially, half-spoken, uncertain, vulnerable to silence. Detectives who understood the streets knew they needed both. Those who relied only on the body and the paperwork risked missing the more fluid intelligence of the neighborhood. At the same time, the media's arrival at certain scenes or after certain discoveries created another distortion. Reporters looked for pattern, menace, drama. A body could become the latest installment in an emerging narrative before investigators had sorted the evidence with sufficient care. This media appetite exerted subtle pressure on interpretation. Once similarities were highlighted publicly, each new scene was read through expectation. Was it the same killer? Was there a ritual? Was South Los Angeles under siege from one predator moving methodically through the dark? Such framing could help force attention toward the murders, but it could also simplify the clues too early. Small differences in victimology, method, body placement, and cause of death might matter enormously. Yet public storytelling prefers unity over mess. The actual crime scenes resisted that neatness. They offered clusters of overlap, yes, but also dissonance. Some women may have been strangled, others shot. Some bodies may have shown more overt sexual violence, others more opportunistic disposal. Some scenes suggested haste, others more control. In hindsight, these differences pointed toward multiple offenders. In the beginning, they were simply part of an accumulating cloud of evidence through which police had to feel their way. Meanwhile, the neighborhoods continued to read the scenes with a clarity institutions sometimes lacked. Residents understood immediately that poor black women were being found in conditions that reflected both individual cruelty and social contempt. They noticed where the bodies were left. They noticed how long it took the wider city to react. They noticed which reporters asked the wrong questions first. They understood that the crime scene did not begin where the tape went up. It began earlier, in all the decisions that had left these blocks vulnerable, these women exposed, and these deaths easier to absorb into the background noise of urban suffering. Thus, the initial clues were never merely forensic. They were civic. Every lot, alley, room, and roadside where a woman was found told two stories at once. One was the immediate story of attack, struggle, and abandonment. The other was the larger story of a city that had allowed certain places to become repositories for its neglect, and certain women to live at such risk that even their violent death seemed, to some outsiders, grimly unsurprising. It is in the overlap between those two stories that Part 5 finds its real power. The crime scene was not just where the victim was discovered. It was where the city's unequal conscience became visible in dirt, blood, shadow, and morning light. The first clues pointed toward men who hunted among the unprotected, but they also pointed toward something wider and harder to prosecute. A social landscape so accustomed to ranking human worth that multiple killers could move through it for too long before the full force of attention finally arrived. By the time detectives began trying to force coherence onto the killings that would later be gathered beneath the Southside Slayer label, the investigation was already burdened by the very conditions that had made the murders possible. It was not simply that women were dead, and that whoever had killed them had moved with enough cunning or luck to avoid immediate capture. It was that the crimes existed inside a landscape where victims were easily flattened into type, where neighborhoods distrusted the police, where media pressure encouraged dramatic simplification, and where several offenders were preying on overlapping pools of vulnerable women at roughly the same time. This made the investigation feel, from the inside, less like a straight hunt and more like a long walk through smoke. Shapes appeared, sharpened, dissolved, then reappeared under different name. Every lead seemed to promise the outline of one answer and then collapsed into several. Families wanted arrests. Communities wanted proof that the city saw what was happening. Detectives wanted pattern, but pattern in this case was both necessary and treacherous. It helped them connect the suffering. It also encouraged them to imagine a singular monster where the truth was messier, more fractured, and more revealing of the city's failures. In homicide work, especially in cases involving multiple victims, investigators depend on repetition. Repetition suggests signature, method, preference, movement, psychology. A woman found in a vacant lot might not be enough to define a serial pattern. 2 or 3 women with overlapping victim profiles, discovered in similar conditions, can begin to alter the atmosphere inside a detective bureau. Conversations change, files are pulled side by side. Maps go up on walls, photographs are placed in rows. Beat officers are asked what they have been hearing on the street. Detectives begin marking geography with circles and arrows, trying to see whether the city itself is yielding a shape. In South Los Angeles, that process began under strain. The victims were often black women, poor women, women living close to addiction or sex work, women whose disappearances could be delayed in recognition because their lives were already unstable in the eyes of the system. Some had arrest records, some drifted between addresses, some were estranged from family or only loosely connected to institutions that might have raised alarms sooner. All of this complicated the basic mechanics of investigation. To solve a homicide, detectives need timelines, routines, names, habits, enemies, lovers, vehicles, places of last contact. But when a woman's life has become fragmented by the street, those pieces are harder to pin down quickly. She may have slept in different places, taken rides from different men, used different names in different circles, owed money, feared police, avoided formal structures, or vanished for short periods before without immediate consequence. A killer looking for such a victim is not selecting at random. He is selecting from a field of reduced traceability. Detectives understood that, at least in part, but understanding a problem does not dissolve it. It only sharpens the frustration. Interviewing the victims' families brought its own ache and its own complications. Mothers sat in worn living rooms and tried to describe daughters whose lives had slipped beyond easy description. Sisters searched memory for the last useful detail, the last name mentioned, the last outfit seen, the last promise made. Children were often left out of the formal interviews, but their existence haunted the process. Because every file on a murdered woman might carry with it the knowledge that somewhere a child was too young to understand what had happened or old enough to understand it forever. Detectives heard stories that did not fit neatly into reports. She was trying to get clean. She had been afraid of a certain man. She had said somebody was following women. She had been acting strangely. She was supposed to come by yesterday. She had enemies. She trusted nobody. She trusted the wrong people. She always got in cars. She never got in that kind of car. She had started talking about leaving. Such statements filled the early investigation with possibilities, but not always with traction. Every fragile detail had to be tested against the city's endless churn of rumor, hustling, survival, and fear. Then there were the street interviews, the long, exhausting work of speaking with women who occupied the same dangerous terrain as the victims. Detectives needed them badly. These women knew the corners, the regulars, the men whose politeness felt rehearsed, the vehicles that kept circling after midnight, the customers who pushed too hard to leave the known tracks and go somewhere quieter. Yet these witnesses had every reason to hesitate. Some feared arrest, some feared pimps, dealers, abusive partners, or the very men the detectives were trying to identify. Some had learned through bitter experience that talking to police could create more problems than it solved. Others were living in such unstable conditions that clarity itself had become hard to maintain. Dates blurred, faces overlapped, a man seen once might resemble another seen 3 times. The city at night has a way of making memory unreliable, especially for people already stretched by exhaustion, trauma, or drugs. So detectives collected fragments: a white car, a brown sedan, a man in his 30s, a quiet one, a talkative one, somebody with a gun, somebody with a badge-like confidence, somebody who seemed too clean for the neighborhood or too familiar with it. Each fragment mattered. None was enough. In the bureau rooms where the case files accumulated, the investigation took on the look of obsession. Maps of South Los Angeles became crowded with pins, sheeted blocks, penciled notes, Polaroids, and booking photographs lay beside autopsy summaries and witness statements. Detectives circled intersections, highlighted dates, drew connections, erased them, drew them again. The pressure to identify a serial offender was strong, not only because the murders seemed to demand it, but because institutions and the media alike find singular narratives easier to manage. One killer means one profile, one manhunt, one arc from terror to capture. Several killers exploiting the same neglected pool of women means confronting something broader and uglier, a civic vulnerability to diffuse to fit a headline. And so, as the investigation advanced, officers sometimes leaned too hard toward unity. Cases with similar victim profiles were read as pieces of the same machine even when differences in method or circumstance suggested otherwise. A body found with one set of injuries was placed beside another found with a different pattern of assault, and the temptation was always to emphasize overlap. Poor black woman, South Los Angeles. Street connected. Dead, the similarities were real. They were also, in hindsight, not sufficient to prove one offender. This is where the dead end begins to take shape. The investigators were not blind, lazy, or uniformly indifferent. Some were diligent, methodical, and grimly committed. But they were working in a fog created by structural neglect, social stigma, institutional pressure, and genuine evidentiary complexity. Every apparent breakthrough led into another corridor. A suspect emerged because he had been seen with one victim, only to prove irrelevant to the others. Another man had a history of violence against women but no clear tie to the current murders. A sex offender with the right age and geography looked promising until timelines collapsed under scrutiny. Detectives pulled rap sheets, interviewed jailhouse informants, leaned on street contacts, checked motel registers, examined vehicle descriptions, and compared forensic details. Again and again they found men capable of brutality. That was the terrible abundance of the landscape. South Los Angeles did not lack violent men. It lacked a clean path from suspicion to proof. The media, meanwhile, intensified the pressure and distorted it at the same time. As more cases were discussed publicly under the South Side Slayer phrase, news coverage sharpened fear but also simplified the story. Reporters wanted numbers, comparisons, panic, a sense of a beast moving through the city. Families, hearing that phrase repeated, often felt that the singular lives of the women were dissolving into a spectacle. Detectives felt another kind of distortion. Public attention sometimes helped unlock resources, but it also forced the investigation to perform certainty it did not possess. People asked whether the police had a serial killer on their hands, whether they had a profile, whether women should stay indoors, whether a man was being hunted. Those questions assumed a clarity that did not yet exist. The truth was that the detectives were not chasing one set of footprints. They were staring at multiple smears in the dirt and trying to decide which belonged together. The broader relationship between the community and law enforcement also deepened the dead end. In neighborhoods shaped by years of mistrust, police did not automatically receive the full benefit of local knowledge. Residents sometimes viewed homicide detectives as temporary visitors from a system that appeared only after the worst had happened. Women on the street were especially wary. They knew that the same department now asking for help might arrest them tomorrow, harass them, dismiss them, or treat them as disposable. That contradiction poisoned cooperation. A detective might sincerely want to stop a killer, but sincerity alone could not undo years of antagonism, so the investigation often advanced in half-steps. Someone would hint at a name, then retreat. Someone would describe a car but refuse to testify. Someone would insist the police already knew who was doing it and simply did not care enough to act. Whether fair or unfair in a given moment, that accusation hung in the air because the murders themselves were unfolding in a hierarchy of empathy the neighborhood recognized clearly. The women most at risk were also women society had taught itself to value less. That fact did not disappear once detectives opened files. It shaped every interaction. There was another, subtler dead end as well, the dead end of victim complexity. Detectives are trained to reconstruct lives in order to identify threats, but when a victim's life includes addiction, sex work, unstable housing, and multiple acquaintances across formal and informal economies, the reconstruction becomes sprawling. Too many men knew her, too many rides, too many temporary rooms, too many nights without fixed witness chains. A single victim may have had contact with dealers, John's lovers, friends, relatives, fellow users, shelter workers, bar owners, pimps, strangers offering rides, and police officers, all within the same week. That density of interaction creates investigative noise. Leads multiply beyond usefulness. Every interview suggests another interview. Every name branches into 5 more. It becomes possible to drown in relevance. Detectives working these cases often found themselves surrounded by facts that seemed important individually but refused to converge. The women's vulnerability had made them easier to target. It also made their social worlds harder to distill into actionable sequences. Forensic science offered some hope, but the era imposed limits. Biological evidence could be collected, fibers compared, ballistics examined, fingerprints checked, wounds interpreted. But the tools lacked the sweeping certainty later generations would associate with DNA-driven cold case resolutions. Some scenes yielded little because the body had been exposed to weather, dirt, insects, and time. Some evidence was contaminated by the nature of the location. Some bodies had been moved. Some assaults left traces, but not enough to identify a specific man among many. And because the cases later grouped together did not belong to one killer, the forensic picture itself was never clean. Different offenders leave different signatures, but when the victims share social characteristics and the geography overlaps, The evidence can feel maddeningly contradictory. One case points toward strangulation, another toward firearm use, another toward a pattern of sexual violence that overlaps only partially with the others. Investigators, wanting unity, can mistake contradiction for variation within one offender, or they can overcorrect and fragment too much. In the South Side cases, the dead end was built precisely from that tension. Too much grouping obscured key differences. Too much separation risked losing the broader truth that vulnerable women in these neighborhoods were being systematically hunted by more than one violent man. Inside police circles, debates sharpened. Were they looking at a serial killer with evolving methods? Were copycat behaviors at work? Were certain murders opportunistic while others belonged to a sexually motivated predator? Could some deaths be tied to intimate partners, some to street customers, some to repeat offenders unknown to one another but operating in the same environment? These were not academic questions. The answer determined where resources went, how suspects were prioritized, what information was released, and whether investigators looked for one face or several. Yet the case would not settle. It remained stubbornly plural beneath the public's hunger for singularity. That is what made the investigation feel haunted. Detectives could sense they were close to something important, but every time they reached for a single explanation, the evidence frayed at the edges. For the families, this dead end was more than procedural. It was emotional torture. They watched the city speak of a growing pattern while still failing to deliver names, arrests, or even the assurance that the women were being understood correctly. Some families believed the police were overwhelmed. Others believed they were careless. Most likely the truth was both harsher and more mundane. Some detectives cared. Some did not care enough. Many were constrained by the limitations of the era and the bias of the system they served. And all of them were working inside a case structure that refused to behave like the stories people tell about serial murder. In the neighborhoods, fear ripened into bitter expertise. Residents began to recognize that the killings were not simply crimes to be solved, but messages about power. Women living close to the street understood that they were not being harmed in isolation. Men were reading the same landscape and coming to the same conclusion, that these women could be approached, taken, brutalized, and discarded with a reduced chance of immediate consequence. That recognition made the dead end feel even darker. It suggested not one hidden monster but a whole social aperture through which several monsters could pass. So Part 6 closes in the thick of uncertainty. The investigation had files, maps, interviews, autopsies, rumors, suspects, and mounting pressure. It had detectives working long hours and families waiting with photographs on their laps. It had witness statements that almost cohered, forensic clues that almost aligned, and a media narrative that almost made sense. But almost is where the dead end lives. The Southside Slayer investigation, at this stage, was not a clean descent toward one locked door. It was a maze built from overlapping crimes, unequal empathy, damaged trust, and victims whose lives had been complex long before their deaths made them legible to authority. Every corridor in that maze seemed to promise a breakthrough. Every corridor bent back into smoke.